Okay, thanks so much. I'm Juliet Eilpern with the Washington Post. We're going to begin this panel because we want to keep close to on time. We're looking at drilling, planning, and preparedness. And we've got three fantastic panelists, and so I'm going to throw out one opening question to all of them, and then we'll follow up with some specific questions, and I believe that there'll be cards that will be distributed if members of the audience want to ask questions in the course of this panel. So starting out, we're going to be talking about how differently are we prepared right now compared to 9 months ago, right before the Deepwater Horizon explosion, and more significantly, since obviously things have not fundamentally changed in terms of planning and preparedness, where are we headed, and to what extent has what the administration put in place, as we just heard, obviously Secretary Salazar was outlining a few new changes, to what extent is that putting us in a direction that will fundamentally change the way we prepare for the potential of accidents that obviously can have tremendous impacts. So I'll just go down the line. Everyone will be able to speak to this question. We're going to start with Kim Fletcher of ABT Associates, then Francis Beinecke, obviously who heads the Natural Resources Defense Council and was a member of the Oil Spill Commission, which just wrapped up its work, and then Eric Bolito, who handles upstream operations for the American Petroleum Institute as group director. So Kim, can you start with, has there been any fundamental change at all? And more significantly, where are we headed on this?
I think context for this is I come from the planning and the preparedness and the response world. And there have not been any major changes in the last 9 months. I think that we have spent a lot of time looking at lessons learned, more like lessons observed, trying to figure out where they fit, what authorities might need to change as a result of what happened. So a lot of that investigation and a lot of that research and delving into looking at the gaps between the authorities is ongoing right now. So I think that we're going to make more progress in the longer run than we have in the last 9 months.
My answer to that would be, first of all, the awareness is much greater, and presumably and hopefully on the rigs themselves, the vigilance is much greater than it was 9 months ago. I mean, one would have to believe that that's the case. Hopefully Eric will substantiate that. In the commission, we reviewed what the systems currently are and how they have to change. Those have not yet changed. I mean, I think the Secretary gave some very good indications of the directions they're going in, but on the response side, we're talking for completely revamped oil spill response plans that are approved by the Interior Department and by the Coast Guard, that there be a greater voice for local and state government in response than there was in this case, and a whole series of recommendations that, the report came out last week, and these things do take time to implement. So, right now, if something well, God forbid, something will not happen, but that because of the awareness of how colossal the impact of this kind of an event can have, and it really is catastrophic in the Gulf, and just reviewing the systems are in place. Our view was the systems need significant improvement, and that will take time to implement.
Actually, significant improvements have occurred. The Department of the Interior came out with new regulations on several fronts, and the way we like to look at it is there's 3 legs to a stool that has to be strong for offshore operations. One is in the area of prevention. And the industry came forward and actually made many recommendations on how to strengthen the prevention side. And this relates to having the barriers that Mr. Riley talked about within your well design and making sure that you have them within every flow path. This is now a requirement, and this is something the industry supports. Also talking about different types of pressure tests and new safety and environmental management plans. These are all now new requirements that the industry fully supports. On the containment side, you're going to hear some more about this from Mr. Williams, I believe, but the companies, through the Marine Well Containment Company and through some other efforts, have come up with the resources and capabilities to shut down a well if there is a blowout. And one area where we continue to work, and there was a talk about not forgetting this and keeping this out of our minds, but the industry right now is meeting in Houston talking about improvements in spill response plans and how we can make sure that happens moving forward and that we have consistent, easy to read, easy to follow plans moving forward. So I think we've seen a lot of it, and a lot of it is in the regulations. The industry fully supports these strengthened regulations, and we fully support full staffing and resourcing of the agencies that oversee us.
And I want to follow up on some of those questions, but one thing I thought we could talk about that all of you could speak to is how the relationship between all the different players in the scenario, whether it's industry, whether it's regulators, the affected communities that clearly are involved, advocacy groups, how that may change, because obviously there are things that, again, the commission outlined that are, for example, different, but also similar in terms of drawing on the industry for its expertise. Kim, obviously at ABT Associates, when you talk about being ahead of, directing global emergency management, it sounds like you're in charge of things when everything falls apart. So maybe you could talk a little.
I'm the queen of the world.
There you go. Yeah. So maybe you could talk about, where you see how significant a change you think there needs to be in the landscape of how these different groups have interacted in terms of preparedness in the past and what needs to be different.
Yeah, the current authorities, and it doesn't really matter whether we're talking just about oil spill and the national contingency plans and the family of plans associated with the national contingency plan, or we're talking about natural hazards and the Stafford Act for disasters like hurricanes and earthquakes, or we're talking about terrorism response. I think we ultimately have to remember that it's the affected community that we're all there to serve all of us in one way or the other. And all of these plans and authorities acknowledge the local communities as having a very big role in planning, preparedness, response, and certainly in long-term recovery. I think that I've studied a little bit about how we use our language, and we keep calling communities the stakeholders. And it's not the guy at the Outback who brings you dinner, but it really, that was a joke. It really is an interesting word, because they're not just stakeholders, they're the reason why we're doing all of this. And I have found over the past years that many communities have the willingness and the will to participate in planning and preparedness and response, but they have neither the resources nor the leadership wherewithal to do that. And I think that changing our language to say these communities are our partners in this planning, preparedness, and response is going to be an important step that we take to go forward. I also think that the way resources and the way authorities and the way planning and preparedness trickles down from the feds, eventually getting down to the local level, is something that we have to recognize, that it takes time to get communities to embrace and to understand a structure that we're going to use for response, or a method of response. And that really takes time. So I would really advocate that we figure out ways going forward to look at how to make communities much more of a partner as opposed to a stakeholder that's somehow held off to the side.
And Francis, clearly this is something the Commission spoke to in its report and talked about, how the National Contingency Plan had traditionally been structured and how there might be changes in how to involve local communities. Can you talk a little about your observations?
Yes, one thing is we did spend a lot of time in the Gulf, and we heard several earfuls from local government, from state government, about the fact that the oil spill contingency plan really didn't envision their partnership. So that was a very key recommendation, that they be brought in early, that they help design it at the local level, and they also are involved in training and response. One thing about the Gulf is they're very experienced in disaster reaction because of hurricanes. But as Kim mentioned, the Stafford Act envisions a very different role for the local government than the oil spill contingency plan is. So that was one element, was state and local government. The other, and this was an experience from Alaska, after the spill there was great interest on the part of citizens to be involved, and they created regional citizen advisory councils in both Prince William Sound and Cook Inlet. And those have proved to be very, very successful in providing ongoing vigilance and preparation. The community is the most interested in ensuring that they're protected. They do review the plans. They're constantly watching what is happening in their community. So we recommended that these regional advisory groups be set up as well, so that not only the local governments, but the affected citizens can play a role and can provide that vigilance, which of course people provide, you know, first and foremost to their own community and to their home.
And Eric, I was wondering if you could talk about, clearly one of the places you really could see a fundamental change is how the industry and regulators interact. Obviously, in the past, MMS took straight word for word, verbatim, you know, some of the best practices of API and others. Could you give a sense of to what extent the industry itself thinks it's willing to change that relationship? And also, when you talk about fully supporting these changes, including the regulators being fully funded, what does that mean, for example, API will be lobbying for, whether it's obviously the Commission raised the idea of new fees. Obviously, there's a real question of what Congress is willing to deliver. So if you could handle those two questions.
Yeah, I could take your last question first on the resourcing. We've already reached out to Congress, and we've sent at least 2 letters, and we've been urging them to fully staff and fund the BOEM RE. And what we are informing them is that the industry pays billions of dollars annually into the federal government through bonus bids, rentals, and royalties that are paid. In 2008 alone, it was over $20 billion. So the industry is paying its share for the opportunity to explore and develop resources. So the money is there. Congress just needs to make sure that it gets put into those coffers of those agencies. When it comes to working with the government, it's interesting because we hear a lot about how the UK does it, and how Norway does it, and how Australia does it, and how we maybe should look to those approaches as to how we should do things here. Yet they have a very, very close relationship between the industry and the regulator. And that partnership is something that helps make the industry and the offshore operations very strong, because the expertise is in the industry and the government can learn from that expertise. So, and you have to have that interplay. Otherwise, if you don't have open lines of communication, that's when things can break down. So we believe that it's important to make sure that we move forward with strong coordination and communication. But we understand we have to be held to the standards set forth in the regulations. So a strong partnership is necessary for a strong offshore.
I'm going to ask Francis to follow up to one of the points you made, but first, how is that partnership? I wrote a whole story which dealt with the partnership between industry and MMS. How would you describe the partnership in, say, and I've spent time in Norway, I've talked to regulators and industry folks there. What is different about the partnership that they've created that has translated into better safety results than the partnership that we've had in the United States with the oil industry?
I think if you talk to folks in industry, I don't think they would say that you necessarily have better safety results here. This is an isolated incident. Over 40,000 wells, over 16 billion barrels of oil produced, one incident like this. So if you compare different regimes, you're going to see strengths in all of them. The U.S. is recognized as one of the strongest regulatory regimes around the world, and Secretary Salazar has stated that before Congress. So, but I believe what we're looking at is from the get-go in any of these regimes, you have a dialogue. So the companies are explaining what their plans are for designing and drilling a well, and the regulators can look at that. And then as you move forward to the exploration phase, and when you're going to get out there, you have open lines of communication during the inspection. So the whole process is one where questions can be asked, input can be sought from the government by industry, so they can make adjustments as necessary. Mr. Riley spoke about a safety case regime. We fully support that. We put workshops on in Texas and Louisiana as to how to implement a safety case regime. So there are ways that we can bring some of those concepts into this offshore operating environment and make them part of it.
And Francis, obviously the Commission came to a different conclusion in terms of whether you should just take existing resources from the revenues that we get, for example, for offshore exploration. Can you talk a little, you know, again, when I talked to, for example, the new chair of the House Natural Resources Committee, he says basically the same thing Eric's saying. I would support reprogramming some of the funds that we're already taking in, but I would not support any new fees like ones envisioned on the Commission. Can you talk about why it might be, why you thought that there was a need for different
Well, we did make the recommendation that basically the industry should be charged fees, and that those fees should pay for the regulation, just as the Federal Communications Commission is paid for by fees in the industry, and the NRC is paid for by fees in the industry. The lease money and the royalties, this is